Donald Trump has torn up the imperialist rulebook that has shaped our world since the end of the Second World War. For 80 years or so, the US enforced its domination through crushing military superiority, combined with a network of multinational agreements on economic, political and social matters that embraced and constrained its allies, including, of course, Australia. Trump 2.0 has changed all that. The US is in the process of withdrawing from 66 international organisations, including the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the World Health Organization and more. And it might be bluster, but Trump is once again threatening to withdraw from the NATO military alliance. In the place of multilateralism, we now see naked US gangster imperialism, threatening Canada and Greenland, sending in troops to kidnap the president of Venezuela, bombing Nigeria, and now, of course, the war on Iran. And the Australian ruling class has been thrown into disarray. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and his senior ministers Richard Marles and Penny Wong are badly torn, and it shows. On the one hand, they are trying to keep their distance from an increasingly erratic and unpopular Trump. They haven't yet agreed to join his ridiculous Board of Peace, and they insist they're not joining the war against Iran. Now, that's not quite true, but we'll come back to that later. On the other hand, they are committed to the US alliance, like their predecessors since the Second World War. Australian sub-imperialism needs US backing to guarantee its domination of the South Pacific and Melanesia, and that means pouring at least $368 billion into US and British nuclear-powered submarines. To discuss all this, I'm joined by Professor Clinton Fernandes. Clinton is in the Future Operations Research Group at UNSW, the University of New South Wales. His latest book is Turbulence, Australian Foreign Policy in the Trump Era. You're listening to The Sound of Solidarity, brought to you by Solidarity. We're a revolutionary socialist group in Australia, and if you'd like to find out more about us, our website is solidarity.net.au. I'm David Glanz, and I'm recording this episode on unceded Wurundjeri land in Naarm, or Melbourne. So welcome, Clinton. It's a pleasure to have you back on The Sound of Solidarity for a third time.
Oh, David, I didn't realise it's been 3 times, but I look forward even to the 4th. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, we seem to have got our numbers mixed up, but that doesn't matter. It's the politics that counts. Look, I want to talk to you about your book, which I found very useful, but we have to start with what's in front of us, the US and Israeli war on Iran. Now, you've had the chance to write opinion pieces almost weekly, as far as I can tell, on the conflict for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Can you recap for us what you regard as your key arguments on this war?
Sure. It's more like a sort of a weekly commentary for the benefit of the public, those that are interested in what I have to say. And so it's not a sustained argument over, 5 pieces or whatever once a week, but I try to do it once a week as a commentary if the newspapers ask me. The broad argument is that what Trump is after is what all American presidential administrations in the post-World War II era have been after. Namely, they want control of oil, not access to oil. And the difference is absolutely crucial. Without that difference, nothing makes sense. Access to oil just means that the United States or any other country wants to buy and sell oil like any other commodity. The United States is not interested in access to oil. It's already got access to oil, and it's had access to oil for decades. It wants control of oil. I'm going to explain the difference. Access to oil means if it wants to, it can buy oil from the West African countries or from Venezuela or indeed from the Middle East. Control of oil, on the other hand, means being able to control the terms on which other countries can access their oil. It means being able to control the revenues when the petrol-rich countries sell their oil to the United States. And so if you look at the Arab monarchies, these are essentially family dictatorships. the Al Sabah family in Kuwait, the Saud family in Saudi Arabia, countries named after the family, and of course the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar. These countries don't just sell oil to the United States or to other countries in the world. They are required to use the revenues they get to make investments in American Treasury securities, in Americans, the stock exchange, in the U.S. stock exchange, in purchasing advanced American weapons, even if their own military personnel cannot use them because they're too technologically advanced, because they provide a subsidy to American high-tech industry doing that. When it comes to oil field reconstructions, major projects, they're required to give preferential treatment, informally, but it always happens like this, to American engineering firms and civil construction firms. So that's not the same thing as access to oil at all. It's about control of oil, control of the revenues. It's a protection racket. And as such, Trump is not radically different. Now, what he is doing differently is at the cultural level, he is making explicit things that were always implied. He is making potent or visible that which was always latent. And he's telling you what he's doing. And he's removing the moral scaffolding, the filter or the alibi that people need in order to follow his orders if you're in the United States military. If you want to provide a narrative construction, if you're in a think tank, which is basically a euphemism for a narrative construction agency, or if you're in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which, as far as its conduct towards the Australian public is concerned, performs the same role. It's a narrative construction agency. What you want is an American president like Barack Obama, who says to Iran, all options are on the table, without specifying those options. But when a nuclear-armed state, which has invaded both countries on either side of Iran's borders, namely Afghanistan and Iraq, and then tells Iran, not only are we in control of Iraq and Afghanistan, but all options are on the table for you. That's an easier sell to the Australian public and to the Western public, which prefers that these things not be said out loud. Once you've got Trump talking about nukes, about a civilization might die tonight, or words to that effect, it removes the alibi, it removes the ability of the foreign minister of this country to spin it. It removes the think tank's ability to provide a narrative construction of benign intentions. And that's what's different about him. I think in core, that's about it, yeah.
On the question of control, it seems to me that the US benefits from controlling the flow of oil both to allies, which it can keep under its thumb. I mean, Japan is highly reliant on imported oil, but it also means it has the potential ability to disrupt oil supplies to China. And China, as I think pretty much everybody who follows world affairs now knows, is America's number one adversary. So that's always been the case. Has that changed with Trump?
Yeah, I'll add one thing, though. It's not just oil. There's other kinds of hydrocarbons, liquefied natural gas, for example. The advanced industrial powers of Europe, and not just Japan, are highly reliant on gas to power their economies. Now, with the sanctions on Russia, they couldn't use cheap Russian gas. With the destruction of Libya, they couldn't use Libyan gas. And then with the sanctions on Iran, they're having a hard time getting LNG from Iran. So the United States says, well, why don't you buy LNG from us, the United States, and we'll ship them across the Atlantic and sell them to you like that. So it's not just the ability to hold Japan's industrial development at risk, but also the Western European countries, right? Now, in the back of all of this is that the United States wants domination over or separation from China. And China requires, hydrocarbons, gas, petroleum, and so on. And it can get them from Venezuela, it can get them from the Middle East. And if the United States had been successful in subjugating Iran, then it could have had the potential to throttle China's growth by threatening its energy inputs. That's really what it's trying to do. The objective beyond the war is the true objective. And that objective beyond the war is domination over or control or separation from China. Now, China, does have its own energy sources. It's got its own petroleum and coal, and it's used technology developed by Germany in the Second World War in order to convert coal into petrochemicals, not just using petroleum. And this was technology developed, in the Second World War, and China has now perfected it. But I mean, the key thing with China is that it has to make a long transit across the Indian Ocean, where it's vulnerable, because in the center of the Indian Ocean lies the island of Diego Garcia, where there's an American military base. It has to get through the choke point that is the Strait of Malacca, in between the Indonesian and Malay archipelagos. And the Submarine Rotation Force West, which is the submarine base that we are establishing for the United States in Fremantle, a place called Turbulence Sound. That would allow the United States, along with Diego Garcia, as well as surveillance facilities on Christmas Island and Cocos Island, to control and, if necessary, sink Chinese ships as they try and get through. Don't forget, during the Second World War, there were 170 Allied submarines located in Coburn Sound near Fremantle, and they were instrumental in cutting off Japanese energy and food supplies. And so that's the reason why the Submarine Rotation Force West is being rebuilt as part of Australia's attempt to use our real estate to demonstrate our relevance to the United States in that overarching goal.
I mentioned in my introduction that Albanese's protestations that Australia is not involved in the war against Iran ring hollow. We know the data being gathered by the RAAF Wedgetail spy plane operating out of the United Arab Emirates is going to the Americans and is probably being used to direct strikes. But surely the big issue is the spy bases in Australia, Pine Gap and the Northwest Cape. Can you take us through how important their role is to US imperialism?
Okay, I think we use the word imperialism in different senses, but I'll accept that term. I mean, I have a kind of a longer historical, more abstract understanding of that term, which is about the control of another society's sovereignty, not necessarily its territory. And I think I've shown in the book that that understanding of empire, control of sovereignty rather than territory, dates back all the way back to Julius Caesar and long beyond, rather than any sense in which you are. And I don't have a problem with the way you're using it. It's just that it's important for people to understand that we're using it in different senses. Nevertheless, I think there's a strong degree of compatibility between how you say it and how I intend it. Now, on to the bases. Pine Gap is the ground control station for satellites that orbit the Earth, located between around the Afghan skies all the way to Japan. Okay, so if you think of a car and you're driving around in your car, you've got a car radio. Well, there's an antenna on the top. That's the satellites. And then in your car itself, you can turn the knob to tune the antenna based on which station you want to receive. Well, that's Pine Gap. Okay, it's the ground control station for the overhead satellites, but not all the satellites, just those that are within the down footprint of the satellite. So, in other words, satellites that are around Afghanistan to Japan. But Pine Gap, its functions, most of its functions now don't need to be performed at Pine Gap. Okay, they can be performed on board the satellites. In other words, if you take photographs and imagery satellites and you listen into to intercept communications, one of the functions of the ground control crew at Pine Gap is to get the best possible image, the best possible audio, the best possible laser designations. But now with advanced processing and computer technology getting better and communications technology getting better, Pine Gap's functions can now be performed on board the satellites. They can generate the best picture on board the satellites. You don't need to have somebody down there. So, therefore, Pine Gap's functions and its relevance to the United States becomes less. As a result of which, we've expanded our space capabilities in order to keep demonstrating our relevance to the United States. But Pine Gap remains relevant, but as I said, it's less so now. The Northwest Cape is a retransmitting station for very low frequency communications between a submarine and a transmitter in the United States. You'll find, if you look at Jim Creek, which is near Oregon, submarines that can get transmissions from there, but they retransmit via the Northwest Cape, the Harold Holt station. And so in the event of a war, the firing orders for American submarines that are going to cut off Chinese shipping or going to attack China in the South China Sea or defend Taiwan, however you want to describe this, the firing orders would be sent from the United States, but then conveyed via the Northwest Cape. So we are part of that kill chain, if you like. The rest of it is basically an attempt to demonstrate our relevance. So we've tried to get them to use Woomera for rocket testing, flight testing of certain missiles. The United States has its own. I mean, it's as big as we are, so it's got its own. It's got its own ranges as well. We'd like them to reestablish a naval base in conjunction with us in Lombrom, which is a PNG, Papua New Guinea base on the equator. In fact, we wanted to do that with them after the Second World War, because it was being used for that in the Second World War during the island hopping campaign against Japan. The United States rejected that after the Second World War, but maybe they'll come back. So all of these things should be understood as part of our desire to show our relevance to an American-dominated East Asia.
Mm.
I mean, that's not good enough. Please ask me a follow-up, and I'm happy to give you some more details. I'm not sure what you're looking for, really.
No, that's useful. I mean, on Pine Gap, it's been widely discussed in the pro-Palestine movement that information gathered via Pine Gap or would have been made available to both America and Israel. With Northwest Cape, it's been reported, or surmised at least, that Northwest Cape would have been a critical link in the chain to the US submarine that sank the Iranian ship off Sri Lanka. Are both those suppositions
you don't need that,
likely?
You don't need that. You don't need that. You don't need Pine Gap to. You don't need Northwest Cape to tell a submarine to sink, something off the coast of Sri Lanka. But sure, the real thing with Northwest Cape, in addition to the submarines, is the space facilities there. Right? We've established. You can look it up. It's called a Space Surveillance Telescope. And the cover story is it's meant to ensure that we have good visibility of space debris, and that's not untrue, but that's not really what it's about. It's about target acquisition. It's about trying to understand what satellites China, Russia, and other adversaries might have, so that they can be either targeted or other satellites which now have a moving arm that can actually pull a satellite out of orbit and shift it off into deep space so that it's lost forever. The United States needs to be able to do that. And so the reason Australia is very important is that we are located in the Southern Hemisphere. And it is only from the Southern Hemisphere, not from the Northern Hemisphere, from nowhere in continental United States. It's only from the Southern Hemisphere that you can look deep into the solar system. Okay? And so it's not physically possible for the United States to do what it needs to do from its base. It has to use the South. And we have vast oceans, clear skies, very, very little cloud cover in that part of the world. And so building space surveillance telescopes and building target acquisition satellites and things like that are all part of this integrated function we perform with the United States. The intelligence needed for the attacks on, the occupied Palestinian territories, they don't need Northwest Cape. And to a certain extent, there are enough local facilities in the Gulf states for the United States to be able to do that. There's also the base in Cyprus, which is actually quite important. And given that it's, it still is West Asia or the Middle East, the Royal Air Force base in Menwith Hill, MENWITH, would also do something that similar to what Pine Gap would do. So it's not that Pine Gap is the only source of targeting information.
To return the focus to the Gulf, I think a few weeks ago when Australia announced it was sending the Wedgetail plane and associated military personnel to the UAE, that caught people a little bit by surprise. And I think people weren't necessarily aware of the depth of the relationship between Australia and the UAE, which includes not just trade links, but also from Australia military exports. Why is Australia interested in embedding itself in the Gulf? And for that matter, why is the Gulf nations, so important and so attractive to Donald Trump?
The Gulf nations are important because they sit above, an ocean of oil and/or basically methane, which, when you cool it to minus 162 degrees Celsius, becomes liquefied natural gas. Okay, so that's why they're important. They're also important because they are quite small, undemocratic, authoritarian states that if there was a wave of democracy that swept across them, they'd be overthrown. The only country that would remain an American ally would be Israel, because its population is completely behind its own country, of course, in the first instance, and secondly, behind the American plan, because that plan benefits Israel. At least it benefits their understanding of the kind of country Israel should be, rather than Israel in some other sense. But if there was a wave of democratic uprisings throughout the Middle East, Israeli foreign policy would never change because it's, as I said, it's basically it's a democratic country in terms of how its foreign policy is pursued. But the Gulf states and Egypt and so on would absolutely change. And that's why it's important. Now, as for people being a bit startled or whatever, that may simply reflect the fact that they had not been focused on the nature of power in Australia and had been distracted by other things. Yelling out pointless slogans like "from the river to the sea," which is not a demand that anybody can place on the Albanese government. It's a bit like saying victory to the NLF in the Vietnam War. It's not a demand you can place on the Menzies government or the Holt government. They've been focusing on other matters that are not about the nature of power and how it's wielded in Australia. They should understand that the core goals of groups of key officers inside the Department of Defense and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade are to stay alert to what the United States might need and how Australia can contribute to it. That is all these institutions, these offices inside defense and DFAT do, right? And so when we purchased the KN-30 air-to-air refueling tanker, we purchased these tankers not because we needed them, but because the United States naval aircraft and the United States Air Force aircraft were incompatible in terms of air-to-air refueling among themselves. So we bought these air-to-air refueling tankers in order to provide niche capability to the American Navy and the American Air Force. That's the entire point of the whole strategy. It's to demonstrate our relevance to the United States. So the E-7 Wedgetail is an important aircraft, but it's not even that the United States would have had to request it. It could have well been that having us and our personnel who are in the regions, the various defense attaches, take a very close interest in what the Americans are doing and try to work out ways in which Australia can be relevant to it. And so it may well have been that informal approaches may have originated from Australia itself rather than from the United States. AUKUS was not imposed on Australia by the United States. It was an Australian initiative. And that's the nature of Australia's defense policy. That's how people should be looking at it.
I'd like to come on to that, but just one quick thought about the Gulf. In a sense, a sort of side effect of that ocean of oil and methane sitting under the region is that these undemocratic dictatorships are now fabulously rich, and that means the Gulf has become a centre for capital. And I thought it was really striking that quite early on in his second presidency, Trump visited the Gulf. He was much less interested in Iran or Israel. He wanted to make nice with the rulers of the Gulf states, and they wanted to cozy up to him. How important is the Gulf now as a centre of capital and capital accumulation on a global scale? Is that now helping to shape Australian policy?
Well, in the first instance with Trump, I should have said this in my previous answer to you. I'm sorry about that. For him, his interests are also personal. So his sons and son-in-law and his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, who in fact is the true U.S. Secretary of State, with a man named Marco Rubio serving as a kind of aide-de-camp to Steve Witkoff, kind of a gopher for Witkoff. Well, Zach Witkoff, who is the 30-something son of Steve Witkoff, now heads investment firms which are heavily involved in cryptocurrency. Some of the other Trump family members are involved in hotels, also in cryptocurrency, and they need Gulf money for that. And so, like a normal protection racket, it would not be unfamiliar at all to the mafia. If you want to keep your economy going, you better pay us some protection. And that means investing in cryptocurrency, putting money into the hotels, doing all those things. So in that sense, yes. Now, as for Gulf money in Australia, we've got close relationships with Gulf states, Qatar, UAE, and so on when it comes to the airline industry, the integration of that. We've got our personnel located in bases over there. Everybody knows they're there, by the way, except the Australian public, right? So this is all highly secretive. The government doesn't acknowledge even which base they're at. But obviously, people in the Gulf know what American bases are in the Gulf, that Australian personnel serve there. And the reason it's secret is to hide it from the Australian public. It's not a secret to anybody else. And as long as the public or activists within it focus on cultural matters or irrelevant matters, it'll remain hidden from the public, even though, as I said, it's quite easy to figure out what's going on. The wider concern, the wider integration between the Gulf states and Australia is more in the area of getting them to invest in our companies, prop up, buy shares in Australian companies in the stock exchange, use their sovereign wealth funds to make purchases. Because the ambition of Australia's leaders, not any particular leader, but just in general, the leadership, is for us to be a better quarry, a better farm, and a better gas well. The fact that we send troops into expeditionary wars overseas is simply the military expression of that sub-imperialism, of that dependency. Right? And so we could, if we wanted to, defend ourselves quite easily. The very few countries in the history of humanity have had as secure strategic circumstances, defense circumstances, as Australia and the United States. Consider the United States. It's got two vast oceans a vast ocean on either side, peaceful Canada to the north and non-threatening Mexico to the south. It even controls the other shores of the other side of that ocean if you're looking at the Atlantic Ocean. And as for Australia, we've got the Indian Ocean and nothing between us and Africa. We've got the Southwest Pacific and the Pacific Ocean, nothing to our south. No country in the north can project force against us. And yet, the most frequently used word in titles of books about Australian foreign policy is fear, or its cognates. Fear of abandonment, the frightened country, blah, blah, blah. And so we want to maintain a strategy of tension in order to have the Gulf region, more and more militarized, so that those countries, these Arab dictatorships, remain militarily reliant on us and on Israel for protection. And so a peaceful Middle East would not suit imperial geostrategy. What you want is a strategy of tension, an atmosphere of tension, so that when the United States dials up that level of tension, it can induce its allies to shelter under the umbrella of American force. And that has a very important role inside those countries themselves, because once you have a strategy of tension and you militarize a country's foreign policy like Australia's, you give more power to the police forces, the intelligence forces, domestic security, and that deprioritizes the social spending debates about the kind of country Australia ought to be, and it creates an atmosphere of threat. So therefore, these are quite functional circumstances in which we relate to the Gulf countries.
Back to your book, Turbulence, but it's a theme which you explored in your previous book, Sub-Imperialism. One of your main arguments is, and you've already expressed this in our conversation, is that Australia's rulers are determined to make themselves visible and relevant to the US. Now, there's a very conventional argument that dominates much of the left and progressive thinking in Australia, is that Australia is simply subservient to the US. But I think your position is somewhat different. Would you like to just elaborate?
I take a rational position, which is that the unit of analysis is not Australia. But at a more fundamental level, I don't buy into the realist understanding that in the theory of realism in international relations, that states are the basic unit of analysis. Rather, groups within the state should be the basic unit of analysis. And it would be quite easily recognizable to yourself, given your socialist commitments, or to anybody who reads Adam Smith about how the masters of mankind, the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves, nothing for the others, things like that. That's a class analysis, right? And so if you want to take that kind of class analysis, whichever thinker you were going for, at a certain level of imprecision, which is normal in the natural sciences, it absolutely suits the 3,000 Australians who are worth about, say, 60 million Australian dollars each, right? These are called UHNWI, ultra high net worth individuals. The studies are put out by Capgemini, by the World Wealth Report, UBS Warburg, to reason about who exactly are the elites in the West. And they find that the cutoff point they use is 50 million US dollars or 65 million Australian dollars. And they find that there's about 3,000 Australians who are worth 65 million Australian dollars or more. That includes everybody in the billionaire class as well, right? Now, those people own a disproportionate share of stocks in the Australian Stock Exchange. That's just by definition. That's where the wealth is. It's asset-based wealth. They're not earning income. It's wealth. And so the stock exchange, 15 or 16 out of the top 20 companies in the Australian Stock Exchange are majority American-owned. And so there is a structural connection between the wealth and prosperity of Australian elite investor groups and American elite investor groups. At a certain level, their fortunes are connected. Right? The reason I focus on the stock exchange is that at any given day, there's about 2,500 to 3,000 companies registered on the stock exchange. But of the market capital of the stock exchange, about 47%, let's say 50% round figures, half the value of Australia's stock exchange, the wealth in the stock exchange, is concentrated in the top 20 companies. And of the top 20 companies, 15 or 16 of them, depending on how the shares move any given day, are majority owned by the Americans. Right. So, take for example Commonwealth Bank. According to the sources that I've listed in various submissions to the Australian parliamentary inquiries, it's 71% American owned. BHP, the big Australian, at one point was 80% American owned. Macquarie Bank, Westpac, National Australia Bank. The few companies that are not majority Australian owned, like Aristocrat, the one that makes poker machines, or Fortescue, the one that's majority owned by the Andrew Forrest family. Those are absolutely majority Australian owned, but the second or third is also American owned. So at the elite level of Australian wealth, there is a structural relationship between American elite interests and Australian elite interests. That is one way to understand the basic unit of analysis. Now, those groups happen to be in control of state power, and that's where people talk about Australia. But actually, it's about the elite investor class, and you can trace them with a certain. These are all. This is the social sciences, of course, so you're not going to get the precision of physics. Nevertheless, there's about 3,000 Australians who are worth 50 million US dollars or more, 65 million Australian dollars or more, and at a fundamental level, their economic interests rely on the same imperial world structure as eight American interests.
And that therefore is reflected in international policy, military policy, alliances, and so on.
And that's sure nobody can tell, right? Because if you look at the people who own the commanding heights of the Australian economy, the Hancock prospecting people in the Gina Reinhardt network, they are frequently visiting Mar-a-Lago, Trump's southern White House, right? They take with them people like, well, I won't mention names because these people are essentially interchangeable. They're functionaries, but various Australian politicians, people who believe in a benign a benign operating environment for miners, for oil and gas companies. Those politicians are frequent guests on the private aircraft of these billionaires when they go to Mar-a-Lago. And so I guess that's really where I'm coming from. These people are advancing their interests. And from the outside, it looks like it's Australia being subservient. It's not. They are in control of state power. They have an interest in an American-led world. And they have the power in Australia to shape Australian policy in their interests.
There's a lot in
of course, at the cultural level, there's also the ideological level, of course, in which there's a belief in American benevolence. But these, I think, are simply cultural manifestations of that economic power. Sorry, David, go ahead.
No, not at all. There's Turbulence is a slim book, but it's packed with really useful information and arguments. One that really caught my eye is highly topical today, and that's the question of Australia's oil, petrol and diesel supplies. And you argue in the book that the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine program is not about protecting Australia's fuel supplies, which are very topical at the moment because of the war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but about helping the US cut off supplies to China. Has the current crisis in the Gulf reinforced that position for you?
Yeah, nothing that's happened in the Gulf has changed anything that I've said in the book. No. Basically, the threat to our fuel supplies, when they talk about sea lines of communication, the fact that a Chinese-dominated southern Solomon Islands might wind up interdicting Australian fuel or trade supplies or fertilizers, that's always been a pretext. If we were genuinely concerned about the security of our fuel supplies, we would have followed the International Energy Agency's minimum days of holding fuel. We've never done that. We've had inquiries into fuel security, and we've always rejected the idea of what they recommended, namely we should be holding more fuel. Because these are always pretexts. These are ways to justify to the public a policy that is designed to be aggressive and hostile. And the reason for that is that the public simply doesn't share the amorality of the people who are in charge of policy. They have to be scared and frightened to doing it. See, when John Howard justified the invasion of Iraq on the grounds of weapons of mass destruction, I saw it as a tribute to the Australian public's morality, that they had to be lied and scared into going along with the policy because they simply would not have agreed with the policy of aggression, right? And so all of these lies and the deceptions and the euphemisms reflect the fact that the government and the people in charge of policy in bureaucracy fear the judgment of the public if the public knew what they were really up to. Mm. And people concerned with changing policy might want to draw tactical lessons from that point.
Talking of immorality, one of the things you highlight in the book is the government's hypocrisy over human rights, and they're very willing to criticise the Chinese government for its record, but they studiously avoid Israel's record of genocide in Gaza and its creeping annexation of the West Bank. Why is Australia so unwilling to call out Israel's crimes?
Well, I think that here we'll have to step back a bit because I've explicitly said it's not hypocrisy in the book. I said it's not hypocrisy and it's not a double standard. Now, let me say what I mean by that. Hypocrisy and a double standard means it would imply that we have one set of standards, namely we support international law in certain areas, like when China is allegedly oppressing this or that group or is conducting various activities in the South China Sea. So we're committed to international law about that and human rights. But when it comes to the Palestinians, we're not committed to international law and human rights. When it comes to genocide, we're not committed to Israeli. So it's regarded as hypocrisy. And I reject that. I mean, I don't think the evidence says that. It shows that there's any hypocrisy or double standards at all. Double standards means that there are two standards. One standard we apply to China, namely we care about international law, and the other standard we apply to Israel, which we don't care about international law. I'm saying we don't care about international law at all. It's one standard, not two standards. The only standard is, does this help the American empire and our relevance to it? Right? It's not that in the one hand they care about international law and human rights, but they don't care about it in the other. If that were the case, if they genuinely cared about international law and human rights in one case and not in the other, then you'd be justified in saying that there's a double standard or that's hypocrisy. It's not hypocrisy. They've never cared about international law and human rights. That's always been an alibi to justify an imperial policy. The real standard, there's only one standard, not two. That standard is how does this advance an American-dominated world and Australia's relevance to it? And given that, criticizing China on the pretext of human rights is relevant to the real goal, the real standard, which is upholding American dominance and so on, they'll criticize China. And protecting Israel is not because they care or don't care about genocide. It's really that it upholds American power to have a powerful Israel doing as it wishes in the Middle East and beyond. So that's the issue. There's no hypocrisy or double standards. There's a single standard.
Okay, that's a really interesting.
Anybody concerned about changing foreign policy had better understand what is actually going on and adapt their tactics accordingly. One of the points I keep making in the book, especially the chapter called Frontline Middle East, is that it is the impotence and weakness and irrelevance of the popular movements and their distraction into these other kind of irrelevant matters that's responsible for their weakness.
Probably the biggest element of the book, it's hard to be certain about that, but is the preparation by the US and its allies for a war with China. And you highlight the role of the RAAF and the RAN in helping to keep Chinese military vessels contained west of the First Island chain, that series of US bases that runs from Japan to Taiwan to the Philippines and now down to Darwin and Fremantle. And that's not what the Australian government tells us. They talk about defending freedom of navigation. So what should we really know about Australia's role in this very dangerous drive to war?
Australian policy is intended to prevent a war. Okay, so we are the people in charge of Australia's foreign policy. These are located in the. If you want to know who they are, I mean, the names don't matter. These people are interchangeable. But look at whoever's in the International Security Division of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Okay, and the Strategic and International Policy Division, or whatever it's called now, in the Department of Defense. These are the ones that implement the policy. They aren't actually formulating it. They kind of implement it, but these are the ones that are doing it. They fear what the public would say if the public knew what they were really doing. So they have to portray what they're doing as defensive, as freedom of navigation, as if we are somehow Dora the Explorer, or maybe we're Matthew Flinders circumnavigating Australia in a kind of benign manner. We are not. What we're really up to is collecting undersea intelligence on the acoustic signatures of Chinese submarines and other Chinese vessels so that we can sink them in the event of a crisis. However, Australia absolutely doesn't want to have a war. And when I say Australia, I'm referring to the people in charge of our policy. We actually do not want to have a war with China. We would much rather China simply behave as what's called a responsible stakeholder in the international system, namely subordinate itself to American dictates, and not become independent and things like that. But really, I think it's fair to say that our policy planners do not want a war with China. If there were to be one, though, we have to be there alongside the United States, because otherwise it would mean the end of the American alliance. So we're hedging our bets. We want to keep selling iron ore to the Chinese. We want to keep selling them the minerals and things like that. We do not want a war. And all our diplomacy, when the government says that they're calling for peace and they're calling for negotiations and they want to tone down the rhetoric and turn down the temperature, it is reasonable to believe them. They actually don't want a war. But if the Americans do it, or if something happens, and we cannot afford to be, in their minds, we cannot afford to be sitting by the sidelines doing nothing. We have to demonstrate our relevance. And that's where Pine Gap, to the extent that it's still relevant, comes in. That's where the Northwest Cape, the submarine, comes in. That's where the Space Surveillance Telescope comes in. And that's where the submarine rotation force and our purchase of submarines, all of that comes in from that point. But we would much rather there not be a war. And that should be understood.
No one wanted the First World War one day before it happened, but sometimes the pressure of great power competition leads to conflict, and this is what we're seeing in the Gulf today. And you entitled the book and its final chapter "Turbulence." And we don't know how the war against Iran will end, and even when, to be certain. But we can be sure that it's making the world an even more dangerous place. If you were preparing a second edition of your book today, what would you add or amend in the light of Trump's attack on Iran?
Given the word limit of about 42,000 words, I mean, the idea was to write a book that a motivated reader could read in a weekend or two. The idea is if somebody was able to read 8,000 words in the morning and the after, or over a weekend, you could do it in a month. There isn't much that I could change really without removing other things.
Let's forget about word limits. Sort of politically,
yes.
Is there anything you would add or amend in terms of your argument?
Right. I would have given more emphasis to Latin America. I put some aspects of Latin America in there, but I left most of what I had to say out in the first edition because, for word limit, really, I mean, that really is a crucial issue, Dave. It really is a factor because what you want is something that can be read by people, and so the word limit is not an addendum to it. It's actually fundamental to how the argument is pitched. However, what I would say is that Iran would have finally understood something that had suspected but could never have been sure of until recently, namely that the true military center of gravity in the Middle East is the Strait of Hormuz. And its long southern coastline, which provides a mountainous redoubt for missiles and so on, as well as the potential to mine the Persian Gulf, that would be counterproductive to Iran as well, of course, if it did that, because even its own ships wouldn't be able to get out. But the true military center of gravity of the Persian Gulf is the Strait of Hormuz, that checkpoint, as well as, of course, the Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, where Yemen's Ansar Allah movement, the so-called Houthis, are involved. I would talk about that and the fact that the petrostates, not Iran, but the other ones, would have had to realize now that Iran cannot be wished away. They cannot simply host American bases on their soil and let the Americans use that to attack Iran and expect it to be consequence-free. Iran in the past thought that its strength came from its medium-range ballistic missiles. Now it knows that its real strength comes from its ability to control the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, and that is the true military center of gravity. To a certain extent, the ability of a coastal state to impose controls over vessels passing by the coastal state is something that Iran has now operationalized. It is something that China seeks to do in the South China Sea in Taiwan. And guess what? Many, many countries in the world, even those that are hostile to China, would agree with China and Iran on this. So, for example, if you look at the Lakshadweep, Lakshadweep, the Lakshadweep Peninsula of India, it's in the Indian Ocean. India rejects the United States' claimed right to sail its fleet right through the archipelago. Okay, the United States says it has the right to do this freedom of navigation. India says no. Many countries in the world, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, even the Philippines, which has a maritime dispute with China, agrees with China that a foreign navy should not be allowed to sell its naval assets inside another country's exclusive economic zone or coastline. Right? India, which has a border dispute with China on the land border, agrees with China on this. Indonesia agrees with China. And so many of these countries, Vietnam, which has its own maritime dispute with China, agrees with China that foreign navies should not be allowed to sell their naval fleets through these islands. And so Iran's attempt to impose a control regime in the Strait of Hormuz would not be would be supported in the law of the sea negotiations with by the other countries, and bearing in mind that neither Iran nor the United States has ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and so that's how I would have. That's the only thing I would have changed in it. Yeah.
Look, I'd really like to thank you for joining Sound of Solidarity again. I look forward to your next book on whatever it's going to be, because your books are always incredibly informative and thought-provoking. And I wish you luck with selling Turbulence. I'll put a link to the book in the show notes so that listeners can find it.
Thank you, David. Thanks for the opportunity. Good on you.